Since October 7th, 2023, curiosity in the relationship between Israel and the United States has been at the forefront of the public conversation. The consensus seems to be that the two countries are very closely aligned, and the United States provides Israel with unflinching support. But whether or not this is a good thing has been seriously called into question. As I write this script, Candace Owens just made an appearance on Theo Von, and Ian Carroll and Daryl Cooper were invited to speak with Joe Rogan. The fundamental question at the center of the conversation is this: is the United States' relationship with Israel appropriate, or do we support them too much? If we do support them too enthusiastically, why is that? And are there any secondary effects which are related? Before determining whether or not our support of Israel is excessive, we should first quantify just how much the support actually is. The primary method by which we support Israel is through economic and military aid. Before Donald Trump began his second term, the United States had supplied over $300 billion of foreign aid since Israel's creation. This is twice as much as the next most, Egypt, and ironically, the reason we give Egypt money is so that they can be good allies to Israel. This aid is also given as grants, which don't have to be repaid, or as loans, which the government just forgives anyway, and so, again, aren't repaid. Keep in mind, this doesn't include the billions of dollars of private donations Israel receives from people with American citizenship. Additionally, many private donations to Israel are tax deductible, which is not allowed for other countries. So not only does Israel receive by far the most foreign aid, but they are required to pay back the least. Another peculiar detail about giving this much money to Israel is that most recipients of US foreign aid are poor countries, aka countries that need aid. Israel is a top 30 country in total GDP and a top 20 in GDP per capita. Egypt, by comparison, is 135th. Ukraine is 111th and being invaded by the third most powerful military in the world. Also, starting in 1982, Israel began to receive all its economic aid in a lump sum within the first 30 days of the fiscal year instead of in quarterly installments throughout the year. Because we run a budget deficit, this means we have to borrow all that money up front, which costs taxpayers more in interest to the tune of $60 million per year. Also, Israel then takes that money and invests much of it in US Treasury bills, which means that when they cash out on their investment, the profit they make is paid by the US government. Combine this with the fact that we either forgive their debt or give them money as grants, and we are now in the incredible position of being a lender that pays interest to its borrower. But it doesn't end there. Unlike other countries, Israel is not obligated to spend all of the foreign aid on United States defense contractors. Instead, they are allowed to convert a portion of it to shekels and spend it domestically. This exception that began in the 80s will finally end in 2028 per the MOU signed in 2016. Of course, that does not mean that the MOU was designed to reduce support for Israel. At that time, its $38 billion to Israel was the largest military aid pledge in US history. Israel historically has also been the only recipient of US economic aid that does not have to account for how its aid is spent, leading to Israel spending the money on projects like West Bank settlements, which violates US and international law. But even when Israel does so graciously decide to spend our money on our economy, it is also the only country whose military contracts with US companies are exempt from prior US review if under $500,000. This leads to serious embezzlement and fraud, like in the case of Rami Dotan, who utilized this exemption to embezzle $12 million of US aid. If you think this favorable treatment is all ancient history, think again. In Trump's first week in office, the State Department was ordered to halt all foreign aid and grants for 90 days, with the exception of Egypt and Israel. And by March 1st, less than 40 days into his term, Trump's State Department had approved an additional $12 billion of military assistance to Israel. All things considered, the foreign aid for Israel, who has one of the strongest economies and militaries in the world, is of the largest quantity, the lowest interest, the fewest conditions, the least regulations, and the fastest delivery of all countries in the world. But our favorable treatment of Israel goes beyond dollar amounts. It's also a matter of diplomatic favor. This is easily evident when examining United Nations resolutions. Between 1972 and 2006, the US vetoed 42 UN Security Council resolutions that were critical of Israel. When looking at resolutions that the US didn't veto, our voting pattern still stands out. There are hundreds of UNSC resolutions concerning Israel, so I'll pick out just a few highlights for you. UNSC Resolution 592 condemned the IDF for opening fire on students at Birzeit University, killing 2. The United States was the only country not to vote in favor. Resolution 605 demanded that Israel desist policies in violation of the Geneva Conventions. The United States was the only country not to vote in favor. Resolution 2334 in December 2016, which affirmed that Israel's settlements in the West Bank are in violation of international law. The United States was the only country not to vote in favor. Resolution 2728 in March of 2024 demanded that Israel stop its assault on Gaza for the month of Ramadan. The United States was the only country not to vote in favor. Moving from the Security Council to the General Assembly, the UNGA condemned Israel 15 times in 2022, more than every other country combined. The United States is the only country that voted against condemning Israel every single time except once, and the one time that they didn't, they abstained from voting. This diplomatic favor has real-world consequences for reaching peace agreements in the Middle East. In 1972, the United States signed a Memorandum of Understanding with Israel, which, among other things, promised that the US would consult Israel before offering peace proposals for Israel and its enemies. This is a practice that persists to this day and provides Israel with substantial negotiation advantages, because rather than Israel and its enemies starting negotiations on a blank slate, the US presents the baseline anchor from which to negotiate from, except that it greatly favors Israel to start with. In the words of Israeli negotiator Ron Pudak during the Oslo Accords, quote, "The traditional approach of the US State Department was to adopt the position of the Israeli Prime Minister. This was demonstrated most extremely during the Netanyahu government, when the American government seemed sometimes to be working for the Israeli Prime Minister, as it tried to convince and pressure the Palestinian side to accept Israeli offers. This American tendency was also evident during Ehud Barak's tenure." Most recently, in the multi-stage peace agreement between Hamas and Israel in the beginning of 2015, mediated by the United States, the first stage of the ceasefire demanded that Hamas release its Israeli hostages back to Israel, but neither the first or the second stage of the ceasefire saw Israel agree to end the war, which is what Hamas wants. Hamas then rejects the agreement, because why would they agree to giving up the hostages, which offer them protection as human shields, if Israel's simply going to continue the assault right after they release them? So President Trump in the United States condemned Hamas for not abiding by the peace deal, and Israel began bombing again, killing 400 people in only a few days. So the evidence is clear. The United States' support of Israel is immense. But is it excessive? Well, perhaps it is, but perhaps it's warranted. Perhaps we support Israel to this extent because they, in turn, provide us with great benefits of our own. Only after examining these alleged benefits can we determine if our support is appropriate. The rationale for supporting Israel mainly falls into two camps: moral and strategic. Let's first review the strategic consequences of our alliance with Israel. The case I find most agreeable for Israel's strategic value to the United States is that they helped us project power and influence during the Cold War. US support of Israel grew substantially after the 1967 war because Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger saw increasing support for Israel as an effective way to counter the Soviet influence throughout the Middle East. The military alliance of Israel and the United States proved to be very powerful in an era where power was persuasion. Israel's intelligence agencies provided the United States with valuable information about the Soviets and its client states over the decades, and Israel's military strength depleted Soviet resources as they rearmed their Arab allies. This contributed to tangible geopolitical victories like in the 70s, when Egypt shifted its loyalty from the Soviets to the United States. A reasonable case could be made that our alliance with Israel is a lingering remnant of Cold War-era foreign policy. But this argument doesn't explain the degree of our support to Israel, both because the benefits themselves are not strong enough to warrant the $500 billion we've given them, but also because there is a less charitable interpretation of Israel's net benefit during the Cold War. Our alliance with Israel helped us contain our enemies, yes, but you could also argue that our alliance with Israel helped create our enemies. Egypt and Syria had both requested to purchase military arms from the United States during the late 40s and early 50s in their conflicts with Israel, but the US always refused. In 1955, when Israel attacked an army base in Gaza that resulted in over 60 Egyptian casualties, Egypt had no choice but to turn to the Soviet Union for military assistance, since the United States, who they had asked first, declined. Additionally, the US's avid military support for Israel during this era prevented peace from being achieved in the region, which still haunts us to this day. This is a common theme that we see over and over again throughout history. The US support for Israel emboldens Israel to seek wars against its weaker enemies rather than settle for peace. Regarding Israeli intelligence, there are plenty of examples of that benefit being overestimated too, like in the lead up to the 1967 war. Israel's intelligence assessments intentionally overrepresented the strength of the Egyptian military to receive more money from the United States, which President Johnson did not fall for. In light of this, US officials on June 4, 1967, invited Egypt's vice president for a visit to discuss ways to restrain Israeli aggression. The Israeli ambassador was told of the plan by our Secretary of State, and so Israel, seeing that the United States was going to engage in diplomacy with its enemies, launched a surprise attack the next day on June 5th, which started the Six-Day War, wherein they ultimately claimed the occupied territories, which they still occupy to this day. Ultimately, the evidence that our alliance with Israel was a net positive during the Cold War is a mixed bag. But when it comes to America's Middle East policy, you can't assume that anything before 9/11 applies after 9/11. So what does the record show for the last quarter century? The most common case made for our support of Israel is that of shared enemies. They aid us in containing hostile adversaries that engage in terrorism against the US and the world. In this worldview, Israel is the frontline defense against Arab Muslim terrorism that threatens the United States. This position became mainstream after 9/11, and Israel stepped up as our, quote, greatest ally in our war on terror. This is certainly what Israel wants us to believe. In 2001, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon said, quote, "You in America are in a war against terror. We in Israel are in a war against terror. It's the same war." In 2002, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, quote, "If we do not immediately shut down the terror factories where Yasser Arafat is producing human bombs, it is only a matter of time before suicide bombers will terrorize your cities. If not destroyed, this madness will strike on your buses, in your supermarkets, in your pizza parlors, and in your cafes." The claim that our alliance with Israel assists us against our Arab enemies is also shared by many top American political figures.
Those and apply those to protect our homeland, Nikki.
Israel
that is
needs
the answer.
America. America needs Israel.
Okay.
The problem with this position is that it gets the causal relationship backwards. We don't support Israel because there is terrorism. There is terrorism because we support Israel. Were it not for the military conquests of Israel in the Middle East, the Arab Muslims wouldn't hate us in the first place. Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, spiritual leader of Hezbollah, said in 2002, quote, "I believe that America bears responsibility for all of Israel. America is a hypocritical nation, for it gives solid support and lethal weapons to the Israelis, but gives the Arabs and Palestinians only words." Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, said in private that he felt guilty for causing US deaths, but that his remorse was overridden by his desperation to stop the killing of Arabs by Israeli troops, and he believed that bombing American targets was the only way to cause change. He also said that he truly believed his actions had been rational and logical in pursuit of a change in US policy toward Israel. Even Osama bin Laden falls into this category. After 9/11, bin Laden's mother said, quote, "In his teenage years, he was the same nice kid, but he was more concerned, sad, and frustrated about the situation in Palestine in particular, and the Arab and Muslim world in general." Before 9/11, bin Laden criticized America's relationship with Israel numerous times, dating all the way back to 1996 in his legal declaration titled "Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places," where he said that blood is being spilled in Palestine and Iraq because of the, quote, "American-Israeli conspiracy." In 1997, he told a CNN reporter, quote, "We declared jihad against the US government because the US government has committed acts that are extremely unjust, hideous, and criminal through its support of Israeli occupation of the land of the Prophet's journey. And we believe the US is directly responsible for those who were killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq." But it isn't just the Islamic extremists that we are causing to hate America. It's the average Arab people too. According to polling done by the ACW and ACRPS after October 7th, the majority of Arabs believe that the most important contributing factor to the current conflict is US military and political support. 59 have become certain that no peace can be established in Israel. 60% say that they follow the news about the conflict every day. 82% believe that the US media is biased in favor of Israel. 94% disapproved of the US foreign policy position towards the conflict, and 51% said that the greatest threat to peace in the region is not Israel, who came in second, but the United States. The point is, any terrorist threat the US faces from the Middle East is motivated by our support of Israel. So to say that Israel is our partner in our war on terror ignores the fact that that very partnership started the terror. In the same week that I write this script, the US has begun bombing the Houthis in Yemen for attacking cargo ships in the Red Sea. Why are they attacking ships in the Red Sea? Because those ships supply goods to Israel, and Israel is mass murdering the Palestinians because its big brother, the United States, allows it to. All of this is to say that the benefits that Israel provides the United States are not nearly great enough to merit the support that we give it. But what if it's a coincidence? Geopolitics can be a tricky thing to predict. Maybe at the time, the evidence suggested that Israel was a great ally to have, and things just didn't work out. You can't necessarily blame anyone for that or accuse anyone of malice. That could actually be true, but what if that wasn't the case? What if there is a mountain of historical evidence that Israel is not a reliable ally? What if there is a lengthy track record of Israel negatively impacting the United States, not through failure, but through treachery? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the reality. The most famous case of Israel harming the US is the 1967 USS Liberty incident, wherein the US technical intelligence ship was barraged by Israeli torpedoes and fighter jets for 2 hours, despite flying an American flag in clear weather conditions. Israel apologized for the American death and destruction it caused and claimed it was an accident, but some speculate it stood to gain from sinking the crew. I won't go into details here because it was never concluded to be an intentional attack, and most people already know about it, but it does fit into a larger pattern. Perhaps the next most well-known case of Israel questionably engaging the United States is the case of Jonathan Pollard, who was an Israeli spy working for US Navy intelligence as an American citizen born in Texas. Pollard shared incomprehensible amounts of government and military intelligence with Israel, some estimates claiming that the amount of documents Pollard sent to Israel was enough to occupy 360 cubic feet, which is over 1 million sheets of paper. His double agency work for Israel was so bad that he was sentenced to life in prison. But if that wasn't bad enough, the Israeli government, after paying him to steal our classified information, granted him Israeli citizenship and tirelessly advocated for his release. They eventually got their way when he was released in 2014 after serving 30 years of his life sentence, and is now considered by many, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to be a Jewish hero for his treachery.
The people of Israel welcome the release of Jonathan Pollard. As someone who raised his case before successive U.S. presidents many times, I longed for this day.
Also related to this incident is the case of the 1985 US and Israel bilateral free trade agreement that still holds to this day. At the time of negotiations, US trade and industry groups were uniformly opposed to an FTA with Israel because Israel's market was insignificant and geared towards exploiting foreign intellectual property. The consensus among US industry leaders was that the deal offered no identifiable reciprocal benefits to the US or its companies. We see today that this analysis was correct. As of 2023, our FTA with Israel has resulted in a larger cumulative bilateral trade deficit than with any other country, adding up to over $350 billion. So if industry leaders in the US saw this coming at the time, why did it pass? It was discovered by the FBI that AIPAC, illegally obtained classified documents containing US trade secrets and passed them to Israel, giving them an upper hand in negotiating and crafting the agreement before it was signed. Nearly $400 billion in trade deficit later, we see the effects. Speaking of AIPAC, in 2005, two members of AIPAC, Stephen Rosen, the Director of Foreign Policy Issues, and Keith Wiseman, a senior analyst, were accused of receiving highly classified information from Lawrence Franklin, a Pentagon analyst with access to sensitive US intelligence. After receiving the classified military intel from Franklin, the high-ranking AIPAC officials leaked it to the Washington Post with the aim of precipitating US military action against Iran. The two AIPAC officials avoided prison time on the grounds of not having criminal intentions, despite the 1917 Espionage Act not requiring criminal intent to enforce. AIPAC isn't the only US lobbying group to engage in this type of behavior. In 1993, the ADL was discovered infiltrating, spying on, and otherwise violating the privacy rights of a large number of pro-Palestinian and other activist groups that went against the Israeli agenda. This information was obtained unethically and illegally, including classified documents that belonged to the FBI and San Francisco Police Department. The ADL ultimately transferred this information to the intelligence agencies of Israel and South Africa. When the FBI began investigating, the Israel lobby fought hard against it, using as much influence as it could, even to the point where two Israeli generals and Israeli Justice Minister David Libai were actually pressuring officials within the executive branch. Ultimately, the pressure was too much and the FBI was forced to close the case before getting to the bottom of it. Not even our universities are safe. In 1992, an unnamed University of Buffalo chemical engineering student sent access codes for military weapons testing systems to the Weizmann Institute for Science in Israel. Conveniently enough for Israel, thorough FBI investigations into the incident were suppressed and shut down, leading to the only punishment as the student being fined $145 and sentenced to 40 hours of community service. As recently as 2014, it was made public that after a virus that attacked computers with military intelligence at Caltech was traced to Dr. Amir Gatt's computer, Amir admitted that he had been sharing sensitive military R&D information with a PhD advisor at Technikon, Israel's oldest university. Dr. Gatt also happens to be an Israeli national, and just like with the University of Buffalo case, the FBI conveniently lost interest in the case before getting to the bottom of it, resulting in no arrest. Finally, all the way back in 1965 was the egregious case of NUMEC. NUMEC was the nuclear material and equipment company, whose business was developing exactly what the name would suggest. The problem is that NUMEC was found to be incredibly careless with their materials. Lengthy investigations discovered that NUMEC lost more weapons-grade uranium than any other federal contractor. CIA and FBI officials both concluded that the uranium had made its way to Israel, which Israel then used to develop their nuclear weapons program in violation of the US's stated foreign policy desires. Would it then surprise you to hear that the president of NUMEC, Zalman Shapiro, was also the president of the Pittsburgh chapter of the Zionist Organization of America? Or that he invited Rafi Eitan, the Israeli spy who went on to be Jonathan Pollard's handler, yes, that Jonathan Pollard, to tour NUMEC facilities? Or how about that the financier of NUMEC was David Lowenthal, who served in Israel's War of Independence as a smuggler? Or that the president of NUMEC's holding company was Morton Chatkin, who also held a ZOA leadership role. Or that the vice president, Ivan J. Novick, went on to become the ZOA's national president. All of these examples prove my point. Not only are the benefits of Israel as an ally questionable when Israel is doing its best to provide value to us, but time and time again, Israel has proven that they do not care about our sovereignty or rule of law. They will directly engage in hostile actions against us. This is wrong from both a strategic and ethical perspective, which leads us to the next category of arguments. Now that we've concluded that our alliance with Israel doesn't make sense from a strategic perspective, what about the moral case? Doesn't Israel stand as a free, democratic, culturally Western nation in a region of the world that is backwards, violent, and militantly against the advancement of human rights? I would say no. Not only does Israel engage in constant espionage and other subversive acts against us, It also does not serve as a moral example for the Arab region that many people think it does. First things first, Israel has a right to exist. It's worth explicitly saying that from the outset, because any criticism of Israel is, to someone out there, an implication that Israel itself and all her people should be driven into the sea. This stems from the propaganda driven into the United States that Israel is in danger of being destroyed. Some people hold to the belief that defending Israel is sticking up for the little guy. They see it as one small Jewish island in the middle of an Arab-Muslim ocean. In reality, Israel's existence is under absolutely no threat whatsoever. Israel's toughest battles were its earliest. In 1948, Israel defeated the combined armed forces of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, plus Palestinian militias. In 1956, it defeated Egypt, and in 1967, it defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It is only after Israel's display of military dominance in the Six-Day War in 1967 that the US started to send huge amounts of financial aid to Israel. Before that war, we only sent about $63 million per year to Israel, and only 5% of it was military aid. We don't support Israel because they're the underdog. If anything, Israel's might is one of the reasons we chose to start supporting it, because aligning ourselves with a powerful country could theoretically help us project power in the region. Not to mention, Israel is the only country in the region with a nuclear arsenal. The main conflict surrounding Israel today is over what's called the occupied territories. Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights since 1967 is considered the longest military occupation in modern history, and a violation of the Geneva Conventions. The initial seizure of these territories at the time involved the displacement of hundreds of thousands of civilians. But it's not just that the initial capture of these lands was the issue, but the ongoing occupation of these lands has led to brutal military action by Israel that goes way beyond what is morally permissible. The most appalling case of Israel's military misbehavior for me can be seen during the Second Lebanon War in 2006. The Second Israel-Lebanon War featured Israel struggling against Hezbollah. The war began when Hezbollah captured 2 Israeli soldiers and killed another 3. If you take the words of Thomas Newman, executive director of JINSA, you would think that Israel's struggles came from its hands being tied by its uncompromising moral code. Quote, "It wasn't Hezbollah that tied Israel down as much as it was Israel's own sense of morality," he said. Israel responded to the kidnappings with a massive bombing campaign against Lebanon, which in turn led Hezbollah to further retaliate with missiles and rockets at northern Israel. Within 2 days of the abduction of IDF soldiers, Israel's bombing killed more than 50 Lebanese civilians. The IDF chief of staff said he wanted to, quote, "turn back the clock of Lebanon by 20 years, and, quote, nothing is safe." IDF deliberately targeted civilian areas like neighborhoods, supermarkets, and water treatment facilities with tens of thousands of missile strikes, leading to nearly 1 million Lebanese civilians being displaced from their homes, over 25% of the country's population. But what really stands out as a moral travesty in this story is Israel's use of cluster bombs. These bombs are extremely destructive for 2 reasons. Firstly, they are highly inaccurate because bomblets spread over a large area, and secondly, because many bomblets do not explode when first dropped, meaning that live bombs will embed themselves in the ground and rubble and function as a cross between time bombs and landmines. The use of these weapons on civilian areas is strongly frowned upon. In 1982, when the IDF was caught using them against Lebanon, President Reagan prohibited the sale of cluster bombs to Israel for 6 years. On August 11th, 3 days before the conflict would officially be ended, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1701, which called for a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Both the Lebanese government and Hezbollah agreed to all the conditions, and the Israeli cabinet voted unanimously in favor of the resolution as well. However, before the ceasefire took effect on the 14th, Israel used the time it had to smother Lebanon in cluster bomblets. Human Rights Watch reports that Israel sprayed millions of bomblets into southern Lebanon in those final 3 days after the treaty was signed, but before it went into effect. In fact, it was estimated that 90% of all cluster munitions used in the entire war were deployed in those last 3 days. Whistleblowers from within the IDF admitted, quote, "What we did was insane and monstrous. We covered the entire towns in cluster bombs." Munitions were still being cleared from the area in 2011, 5 years after the war ended. Israel has also responded horrifically to nonviolent protests. During the First Intifada, the IDF distributed clubs to its troops and encouraged them to break the bones of Palestinian protesters, who were majority nonviolent. The Swedish branch of the Save the Children organization estimated that nearly 30,000 children in the occupied territories had been beaten in the first 2 years of the conflict. 1/3 of these children had broken bones, and 1/5 of these children were under the age of 6. Save the Children also concluded that out of the 106 children who died to gunshot wounds, almost all of them were, quote, hit by a directed, not random or ricochet gunfire. 20% of these children suffered multiple gunshot wounds, 15% were 10 years old or younger, 12% were shot from behind, and 20% were shot within 10 meters of their homes. And for anyone about to say that Israel has the right to defend itself, I again stress the fact that the First Intifada was a largely non-violent uprising. In the first year of the protests in Gaza, 0 Israelis had been killed, but 142 Palestinians had been. Of course, as of early 2025, the most recent wave of conflict is still ongoing that began on October 7, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel. Since then, the response by Israel has been unrelenting. Israel likes to say it has the most moral military in the world and that they are strictly at war with Hamas. But the reality is that the majority of the Gaza Strip and the people in it have been under assault. 69% of the buildings in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed, including 50% of hospitals, 68% of farmland, 88% of schools, and 83% of mosques. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, home to 2.4 million people. 50,000 people have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. Most of these deaths have been civilians, with the highest estimates putting 70% of the deaths being women and children. This is the definition of indiscriminate. Is Israel targeting civilians in Gaza? I don't know. But they are certainly not taking any precaution to spare them. But what about Hamas? Isn't this Hamas's fault for the brutality they subjected the Israelis to on that day? Well, if we're going to make a moral argument here, whatever moral high ground Israel may have had over Hamas has been forfeited. The IDF treats Palestinians every bit as badly as Hamas treats Israelis. In July of 2024, chaotic protests broke out in Israel after footage surfaced of IDF members sodomizing Palestinian prisoners of war with a broomstick. The protests escalated to the point where an army base was actually broken into. You may be thinking, that makes sense, sexually torturing prisoners is unacceptable. But actually, the protests were not at the actions of the IDF members who tortured the prisoners, but instead, the protests were in response to these soldiers being arrested. Hanok Mildwitsky, a member of Israel's legislative branch of government, was asked whether it was legitimate, quote, to insert a stick into a person's rectum. His response was,
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו.
אוקיי,
הכל.
מצוין.
הכל.
So if Israel's strategic value, its loyalty to the US, and its moral decisions don't explain the enormous support that the US provides it, what does? Well, the argument with the strongest evidence is that the US's unyielding support of Israel is the result of a powerful and sophisticated Israel lobby that directly influences the government. Let's take the example we explored earlier, the Iraq War. I've already explained how partnering with Israel in the war on terror wasn't strategically beneficial to the United States. So why did our government go all in on the war on terror? The justification that the government gave us for invading Iraq was that they were acquiring weapons of mass destruction. But where do you think we got that bad information from? This conclusion was arrived at in no small part because of misleading Israeli intelligence reports. In hindsight, it was clear that Israel wanted us to invade Iraq for their own gain. After the invasion, the Senate Intelligence Committee and Israeli Knesset released separate reports revealing that much of the intelligence Israel gave to the Bush administration about WMDs in Iraq was false. In fact, before the invasion, when the issue was brought to the UN Security Council, Saddam Hussein agreed to allow UN inspectors into Iraq. Everyone seemed pleased with this transparency, except Israel. PM Ariel Sharon visited Moscow to tell Putin that it was too late for inspections to be effective. Foreign Minister Shimon Peres said, quote, "Dishonest people can overcome inspectors," and even became so frustrated by the unanimous agreement to have W&D inspections that he questioned France's status as a permanent member of the Security Council. An article in the foreword said, quote, "Saddam Hussein's surprise acceptance of unconditional United Nations weapons inspections put Israel on the hot seat this week for forcing it into the open as the only nation actively supporting the Bush administration's goal of Iraqi regime change." Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak said, quote, "Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program provides the urgent need for his removal." Benjamin Netanyahu said that Saddam was, quote, "feverishly trying to acquire nuclear weapons." The member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow, told a University of Virginia audience on September 10, 2002, that Saddam was not a direct threat to the United States. Quote, "The real threat is the threat against Israel. And the American government doesn't want to lean too hard on it rhetorically because it is not a popular sell." General Wesley Clark, the retired NATO commander and former presidential candidate, said in August 2002 that, quote, "Those who favor this attack now will tell you that Saddam Hussein is no threat to the United States, but they are afraid that at some point he might decide that if he had a nuclear weapon, to use it against Israel." In April of 2002, Benjamin Netanyahu told American journalists that Saddam was developing nuclear weapons that could be delivered against the American homeland in suitcases or satchels, and made multiple visits to Washington, D.C. to persuade us that war with Iraq was good. Israeli government spokesperson Raanan Gisson said, quote, "If Saddam Hussein is not stopped now, we will have to deal with an Iraq that is armed with nuclear weapons." Prime Ministers Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak argued the same thing. The pressure on Bush and the US to invade Iraq also came from within the US from the Israel lobby. White House official Douglas Feith had connections to the Zionist Organization of America and Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, where he was a member of the board. He even wrote articles defending Israel's domination over the occupied territories, which, as we discussed earlier, is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. The Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations voted to support the use of force in Iraq. Mortimer Zuckerman, the chairman of the Conference of Presidents, also happens to be the editor-in-chief of the U.S. News and World Report. In it, he wrote, quote, "Those who predict dire results if we try to unseat Saddam simply refuse to understand, as President Bush manifestly does, that if we opt to live with a nightmare, it will only get worse. Much worse. The best medicine here, in other words, is preventative medicine." Journalist Nathan Gutman reported, quote, "So long as Israel supports the war, so too do the thousands of AIPAC lobbyists who convened in the American capital." AIPAC Executive Director Howard Kaur told the New York Sun that, quote, "Lobbying Congress to approve the use of force in Iraq was one of AIPAC's successes over the past year." In a New Yorker profile of AIPAC's policy director Stephen J. Rosen, yes, that's Stephen J. Rosen, Jeffrey Goldberg reported that, quote, "AIPAC lobbied Congress in favor of the Iraq war." In the fall of 2003, when the Bush administration was having difficulty convincing Senate Democrats to allocate more money for the war, Senate Republicans asked AIPAC to lobby their Democratic colleagues to support the funding request. AIPAC representatives talked to some of the Democratic senators, and the money was approved. The Project for the New American Century, a think tank started by Jewish Zionist billionaire Bill Kristol, organized a letter calling for regime change in Iraq in 1998. Many of the people who signed this letter, like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perley, and Elliot Abrams, went on to secure positions in the Bush administration. There is example after example of highly influential people in Washington who had ties to Israel and the Israel lobby pushing for the Iraq invasion. I could go on for hours, but the point is this. Saddam Hussein didn't have any nuclear weapons, a strong economy, a strong military, nor any connections to 9/11. We invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein because Israel wanted us to. In fact, the Israel lobby is so powerful that they're careful not to make it too obvious. During a speech given in March 2006 about the danger of Iran, President Bush said, quote, "The threat from Iran is, of course, their stated objective to destroy our strong ally Israel. That's a threat, a serious threat. I made it clear, I'll make it clear again, that we will use our military might to protect our ally Israel." This instance, and many other instances of Bush being overly enthusiastic in his pro-Israel rhetoric, made the Israel lobby very nervous. The Forward reported, quote, "Jewish community leaders have urged the White House to refrain from publicly pledging to defend Israel against possible Iranian hostilities." This was even concerning to Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who told pro-Israel groups to slow down on the Israel propaganda because, quote, "We don't want it to be about Israel." To understand why the opinions of people in these positions matter on shaping policy, it's not only a matter of proximity influence, but also of financial influence. Winning an election means running an effective, expensive campaign, and candidates critical of Israel are cut off from a huge number of important donors. On the flip side, being staunchly pro-Israel can sometimes give a candidate the push they need to win an election. Take Harry Truman. During the 1948 presidential election, he was way behind in the polls, and with little time left until Election Day, Harry Truman met with Abraham Feinberg. Feinberg was a Zionist Jew who helped illegally smuggle arms into the Haganah, which eventually became the IDF after Israel was established, and used his vast wealth to support Zionist organizations his entire life. Feinberg promised Truman the campaign contributions he needed in exchange for US support in creating the State of Israel. Truman himself even said that, quote, "Jewish leaders in the United States were putting all sorts of pressure on me to commit American power and forces on behalf of the Jewish aspirations in Palestine." With Feinberg's money, Truman ran his historic Whistle Stop Tour campaign, which secured him the presidency. Today, Truman's victory in 1948 is considered the greatest election upset in American history. It should not surprise you then that 9 days before planning for this re-election campaign, President Harry Truman officially recognized the State of Israel without even consulting the US State Department. A decade later, John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign tells a similar story. JFK's entire family had a rocky relationship with Israel due to their controversial views on Jews and Adolf Hitler, but the time came when Kennedy needed money. He met with Abraham Feinberg and 20 other high-profile political financiers who grilled him about his views on Israel. The next day, JFK was furious, and he visited his close friend Charles Bartlett to blow off steam. Bartlett said, quote, "As an American citizen, he was outraged to have a Zionist group come to him and say, 'We know your campaign is in trouble, we're willing to pay for your bills if you'll let us have control of your Middle East policy.' Quote, 'They wanted control,' end quote," Kennedy said. Furious as he may have been, a presidential campaign doesn't pay for itself. After accepting Feinberg's money and winning the presidential election, Kennedy pardoned criminals who had smuggled military hardware to Israel and made appointments that Feinberg approved of, including Mike Feldman, who was given authorization to monitor all secret US State Department and White House cable traffic pertaining to the Middle East. As influential as the Israeli lobby is over presidential elections, its grip over Congress is really where its power is evident. In my video about political corruption, I mentioned that 90% of winners of congressional races are the candidates who receive the most money. But you could make the case that there is an even stronger predictive metric than fundraising amounts. It's Israeli support. According to the AIPAC Political Action Committee, in 2024, 98% of AIPAC-backed candidates won their general elections, and 80% of freshman Congress members were AIPAC-endorsed in 2024. Put differently, for every 50 candidates that are AIPAC-supported, 49 of them win. And for every 5 new members of Congress, people who are getting their big break in their career, 4 of them are AIPAC candidates. The consequences for opposing AIPAC are just as evident too. Of the 12 anti-Israel candidates that AIPAC targeted in 2024, 11 of them lost their elections, including big-name incumbents like Jamal Brown and Cori Bush. Journalist Michael Massing reported that a congressional staffer sympathetic to Israel told him, quote, "We can count on well over half the House, 250 to 300 members, to reflexively do whatever AIPAC wants." Similarly, Stephen Rosen, yes, again, that's Stephen Rosen, once put a random napkin on a table in front of a reporter and said, quote, "In 24 hours, we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin." Congressman Thomas Massie claims that it's so pervasive that he's the only Republican who isn't owned by Israel.
And I have Republicans who come to me and say, that's wrong what AIPAC is doing to you. Let me talk to my AIPAC person. By the way, everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What makes this all even worse, however, is that Israel is able to do this without any obstacles in their way. While organizations that represent other countries like China or Japan have to register under FARA, many Israel organizations don't. This has the effect of hiding Israeli influence in the government to even curious people. I myself had no idea that Israel had any influence over our government when I made my video on lobbying 2 years ago, because when I checked the donation amounts for foreign countries, Israel wasn't on there. The previously referenced AIPAC and UDP alone add up to over $100 million, which would be 4 times Japan, currently listed as the highest country for 2024. Once you understand that the Israel lobby greatly influences our Middle East policy, it becomes easy to understand that this same influence can also be wielded towards goals in media, academia, and social issues in America. Starting with education, the main goal of the Israel lobby in education is to cultivate sympathy among American students from the time they are children going through the educational system. Professor and political scientist Norman Finkelstein notes, quote, "Many more undergraduates are able to place the Nazi Holocaust in the right century and generally cite the number killed, as compared to the American Civil War, and that more Americans can identify the Holocaust than Pearl Harbor or the atomic bombing of Japan. Everyone knows that the Holocaust was the event where Nazis killed 6 million Jews. But what about other important events to American history? How many Americans know the death count of the Civil War or Vietnam? Is there any other war in history that the average American can cite the death count of? Or is it just Jews in World War II? What's even stranger is that it wasn't always this way. In fact, in the 50s and 60s, immediately after the war had ended, Americans and even Jews were not so occupied with the Holocaust and Israel as they are today. Membership of the Zionist Organization of America dropped from 1948 to 1967 by 90%. And in 1967, only 1 in 20 Jews reported wanting to visit Israel. Additionally, there was only one university course dedicated to the Holocaust in the United States. It was after the 1967 war, when the United States began building its strong alliance with Israel, that things started to change. It wasn't just the US military or government that became interested in Israel, but American Jews as well. In the words of political commentator Norman Poderitz, the state of Israel became, quote, the religion of the Jews after 1967. The effort to convert the average American into a Zionist began. While in the 60s, there were only 2 research books available in English and 4 major motion pictures released about the Holocaust, in the 90s, there were 108 books published and 16 movies about the Holocaust. While it seems that the Holocaust may be the historical event which Americans receive the most education and propaganda about, it's never enough. As of the time of writing this script, President Donald Trump revoked $400 million of federal funding from Columbia University for anti-Semitism. During the Israel and Palestine protests in 2024, NYU made Zionist a protected class for academic purposes. Isn't it curious that for decades, white students had been discriminated against in college admissions and for scholarships, and nothing changes? But the moment anti-Israel sentiment becomes popular, the universities go into overdrive to squash it. In fact, this wouldn't be the only time that there was selective consideration of racial grievances by Jewish Americans. During the Civil Rights Movement, Jewish people were largely in support of Black Americans fighting for racial equality. But once the Civil Rights Movement started addressing class or wealth inequality, their support for the movement halted. Jonathan Kaufman reports, quote, "The goals of the Civil Rights Movement were shifting from demands for political and legal equality to demands for economic equality." Cheryl Greenberg said, quote, "When the Civil Rights Movement moved north into the neighborhood of liberal Jews, the question of integration took on a different tone. With concerns now couched in class rather than racial terms, Jews fled to the suburbs almost as quickly as white Christians." This was on full display in 1968 during a New York City teachers' strike, which was suppressed by allegations of anti-Semitism from the largely Jewish academic officials. Israel also has a very concerning level of influence on American law enforcement. For example, in 2007, a memorandum of understanding was signed between U.S. Director of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff and Israeli Minister Avi Ditcher to formalize training agreements for law enforcement. 45,000 law enforcement officials have been trained through the ADL's Law Enforcement and Society program, which is now a required curriculum for all new FBI special agents. The New York Police Department borrowed IDF tactics when monitoring Muslim diasporas in the name of anti-terrorism efforts. Washington, D.C.'s Chief of Police, Kathy Lanier, in 2009 said, quote, "No experience in my life has had more of an impact on doing my job than going to Israel." Is that a good thing? Do we really want the people throwing U.S. citizens in jail to be greatly impacted by Israel? In the 1950s, the U.S. funded law enforcement in other countries to combat communism. That is, protect our ideological and political interests. So why does Israel fund ours? Just like with education, many of the public's understanding of Israel is skewed because of the media, which is largely pro-Israel. This is especially easy to see when comparing to other countries. In 2016, an international poll was done asking citizens of different countries whether Israel occupied Palestinian land or Palestinians occupied Israeli land. To no one's surprise, the United States was the only country where the most selected answer was B. Palestinians occupied Israeli territory, a statement that 49% of Americans agreed with. A Pew Research poll in 2003 found that in 20 out of 21 countries surveyed, either a majority or plurality of the population believes that U.S. Middle East policy favors Israel too much. Even Israelis agreed. An analysis done by Eric Alterman in 2002 found that he could identify 56 columnists and commentators who can be counted on to support Israel reflexively and without qualification. Conversely, Alterman identified only 5 pundits who consistently criticize Israeli behavior or endorse pro-Arab positions. An analysis done by The Intercept in 2024 found that while the number of Palestinian deaths increase, the mention of Palestinians in news articles decrease. This may suggest that while the news is happy to report on unflattering actions by Palestinians, when Palestinians are overwhelmingly victims in the conflict, they don't want to focus on that. Being fed Israeli propaganda is a big deal because it seriously distorts what people believe about the major players in the region. In 2014, 59% of Americans believed that Iran was in possession of nuclear weapons, despite the fact that there is no evidence of this, and Iran has said on numerous occasions that stockpiling nuclear weapons is a violation of Islam. It is now 2025, and Republicans are still saying that Iran is close to having nuclear weapons. How many times are Americans going to fall for the weapons of mass destruction lie? I could go on forever, but the point is this. If you want to understand why powerful people make the decisions they do, you need to understand what is influencing those decisions. And the fact is that the Israel lobby in America has tremendous influence. So if there's any advice I would give to someone who seeks to identify the effects of influence in the future, it is this: be skeptical. When Ben Shapiro says that his loyalty to America is conditional based on Israel, be skeptical.
I think to think that that's why the existence of the state of Israel is the single greatest guarantor of my loyalty to the United States, frankly.
When Donald Trump takes $100 million from Miriam Adelson and then signs an executive order that allows him to deport anti-Israel protesters rather than the 50 million illegal aliens that we voted for him to, be skeptical.
And we're going to make Israel great again.
When Barack Obama angered the Israeli Foreign Ministry and then apologized for it by laying a wreath of flowers on the grave of Theodore Herzl, be skeptical. When all of our presidents, for some reason, make a visit to Israel's Western Wall, be skeptical. And when AIPAC, an organization founded by the son of Theodore Herzl's best friend, becomes the most influential lobbying organization in the country, be